Hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to Macduff Lives, and welcome to another special edition where we welcome Harley Schlanger all the way from Potsdam, Germany, to our show for a review of the most interesting and crucial issues that we face today. Harley, welcome. Thanks for joining me again.
Hi, John. Good to see you.
All right. Well, I think we should start with the question I posed as I named our show this morning. Basically, this: will NATO fight for Crimea?
And that is the question right now. Last week, or 2 weeks ago, the New York Times ran a story saying that the Biden administration is warming to the idea of attacking Crimea. Now, this has been the strategy for some time coming from British think tanks. The Atlantic Council, which is a British American think tank, Chatham House, RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, all of them have talked about Crimea as the real fight, the real battleground. RUSI even said the Crimea situation would be a Crimea-Cuban Missile Crisis. That is the potential trigger for nuclear war. Now you have, in the last couple of days, Reznikov, the defense minister, saying that ultimately we're going to get Crimea. You have this coming from Ned Price, who said we can't take it off the table. I mentioned today in my update that the whole Crimea situation goes back to Obama when the referendum took place. And remember, in March 2014, after the February coup, there was a referendum, and the people of Crimea could vote. And there was 80% turnout, and 90% of them voted to break from Ukraine and join Russia. Obama said this violates the Ukrainian constitution and would never be recognized by the US and the international community. I wonder if he didn't think about the fact that the coup 1 month earlier violated the Ukrainian constitution. But obviously, who's to quibble with a lawyer like Obama? So, the Crimea situation, it is moving. The problem, it really reflects where the war is headed. The Russians are moving back to finish the job in the Donbass and make the connection through the southern part of the country to Crimea, so that there's a strip of land there that will be connected. The Ukrainians, when they launched the offensive last summer, intended to shatter mass forces of the Russians and then use that as a staging area to go into Crimea. As things stand now, the problem they have is the HIMARS missiles don't reach into Crimea from where they're placed in Ukraine. So they need different weapons. And so Reznikov said we need F-16 fighter planes, we need specialized drones, we need the special missile systems. And so that's what they're appealing for, and that's where the Crimea situation stands at this point.
Remind me, please, who is Reznikov?
Reznikov is the defense minister of Ukraine.
Of Ukraine, okay.
Yeah.
And now that the one that got killed in the helicopter crash was the defense minister, right?
No, that was the interior minister.
Okay, I was mistaken. Okay, got you.
There's an interesting aspect to that, because this is the other thing. Ukraine seems to be in the throes of certain kinds of internal fighting over the corruption question. Now, obviously, this has to do with the fact that they're about to get $17 billion from the International Monetary Fund to enable them to pay some of their outstanding debts and keep their government functioning. On top of which, they have the tens of billions coming from the US and NATO. And they're still listed as Europe's most corrupt country. They've done nothing to address this going back to the Maidan coup. And so all of a sudden, they're starting to fire people who are taking a few 100,000 here, a few 100,000 there. I'm sure the corruption is much bigger than that. But in the midst of this, something really fascinating occurred, which is that the guy who was the chief negotiator with the Russians back in March of last year, a man named Kireev, he was a banker, and he was the one who was doing the Belarus negotiations with Russia. After a meeting with Russian negotiators, his car was pulled over. He was pulled out of the car, shot in the head, and left on the side of the road. Now, initially, they tried to say the Russians did it or the Ukrainians backed by Russia, but that didn't make sense. Now it turns out that the head of the GUR, which is the military intelligence unit of Ukraine, said that it was the SBU, that is Ukraine's Secret Service, that shot and killed him. And the reason is they had been told he was a Russian agent. But the head of the military intelligence said, no, he was one of our men. And so you see this infighting. And again, this is a sign of the corruption, the instability, and what the big problem is in Ukraine. No one's sure who's on which side and who to trust. And that's the country we're entrusting with $110 or so billion worth of aid from the United States, including very sophisticated weapons.
Yeah, and we seem to be almost saying we're at war. It's almost as if Minister Baerbock was sent out there to say that what appears to have been a gaffe, and to just to let everybody know that we really are. We're just, it's a nod and a wink saying, well, yeah, sure, we're not, but we are.
Well, I'm not sure she was sent out to do it. She's one of these examples of someone who's not competent to hold the position she's in.
Okay.
And when you put together coalition governments, very often what you do is you bring in people who are not qualified, but who do represent a faction. I mean, the Green Party, I think, got 14% in the last election. But that was necessary for Scholz to put him over the top to be the chancellor. So he brought her in, along with Habeck, her co-party leader with the Greens. And the two of them are literally the least competent of all the cabinet ministers. So I don't know that Baerbock was sent out to say that. I think that was truly a gaffe. But here's the problem. In a normal country, she would be fired.
Right.
And in Germany, Scholz is speaking against her privately. And it was leaked to Bild Zeitung, which is the largest tabloid paper in Germany, that Scholz was mad about this. But, you're basically having the foreign minister say to the world, we're at war with Russia. And that's the kind of gaffe which could actually lead to an escalation by accident. So I think the message here is that the Green Party has to go. The Green Party initially was set up as a peace party, and it's now the most militant of the parties in the war cabinet.
Boy, when you said that, I just thought, of my history with the Democratic Party and how I thought I was with the Peace Party. I don't think that's anywhere near the Democratic Party anymore. They are completely with the war, and I had not really studied things from the liberal Democratic side of the details of how they view the world for 4 or 5 years now. And I ran across an article by a writer named David Livingstone, with an E on the end, the same name as the African
explorer,
but a writer who's written a number of fascinating books. But in his most latest chapter of a book called Ordo ab Chaos that he wrote, he goes into great detail about how the voters for the Republicans are just all manipulated by people like Paul Manafort, Roger Stone. Before that, Lee Atwater. Then it's all about how Pat Buchanan, and then it's just layer after layer of saying, well, what this really is, this is just a cover for racism, and all these people are really just in their guts racists, and I think that has something to do with the reason that we just can't seem to break through to the average liberal Democratic voter is that they've somehow inhaled this message that no matter what they say, they really are is racist. How is that? Does that fit with your perception? I'm trying to figure out how in the world it is that we now have what I consider to be the most liberal, in a good sense of the word liberal. That means loving everyone. Everybody should, let's get along. Let's not fight. That kind of liberal. How do we get to the point where they are the primary supporters of this war against Ukraine, against Russia, and the wind underneath the sails of Joe Biden? How did they get to do that?
Well,
I'm
John,
puzzled.
I don't know if you remember this folk singer Phil Oakes, who had
Sure.
this song "Love Me, Love Me, Love Me, I'm a Liberal." Do you
No, I
remember
don't.
that one?
I wasn't a Phil Oakes was just about 2 years before me when I started getting into folk music.
Well, if you listen to that, you'll see that that tendency was there with liberals. You know, I cried when they shot Medgar Evers. The tears ran down my cheeks. I cried when they shot John F. Kennedy, like I'd lost a brother of mine. But Malcolm X got what he asked for. He got what he asked for this time. Love me, love me, love me. I'm a liberal. It basically, the Democratic Party after World War II had a split in it that was complete. Roosevelt, who emerged as a Wall Street figure, I mean, he was from the Wall Street grouping of the New York Democratic Party, but had a different tradition in him, going back to the Revolutionary War Roosevelts, the family that benefited from the Hamilton infrastructure and internal improvements policy. And so when he became president, he went completely with the Hamiltonian policy that you go after the banks, you go after, you have a credit policy that invests in infrastructure, and that's the way you improve the conditions of working people. You build the physical economy, and that's what Roosevelt did. Now, the Republicans said, no, Roosevelt was a communist. Roosevelt was a left wing trying to destroy capitalism. The irony is Roosevelt probably saved American capitalism because there was a growing ferment that was building the socialist and communist parties and the labor movement before Roosevelt came in, and Roosevelt steered them toward the American system. Now, he was opposed to the Harriman faction, the Dean Acheson, the hardline military faction in the Democratic Party that was tied to the Republicans. And this is where you see over and above the left and right and Democrats and Republicans were what was called during that period of time synarchy. And synarchy was the term that was applied to corporate capitalism, which the US intelligence community had a whole file on this, saying corporate capitalism, i.e. fascism, because that's what it was. This was the Mussolini role in putting the corporations in charge of the state, and that the government would make the corporations prosper by functioning as an enforcement arm on wages and certain other things. And this was on steroids what Hitler did under the direction of Hjalmar Schacht, who was his finance minister. Now, Roosevelt opposed that, and Roosevelt was a very effective leader, but the Democrat and backing him up was Henry Wallace, his vice president from the 1940 campaign. But the Truman faction threw Wallace out and put in Harry Truman in 44. And Truman became the vehicle that was used by Winston Churchill to put the Wall Street boys in charge of intelligence. They were already in charge of the financial sector. And this is what John Kennedy was fighting in the early 60s. He was fighting the Wall Street Democrats. And Kennedy's assassination put those Wall Street Democrats in a much stronger position. But it was fully consolidated in the mid-1980s by Al Gore in particular, who went with the Henry Jackson Democrats. You may remember Scoop Jackson, the senator from Washington, who was a Cold Warrior. And so you had this Cold War tendency merge with the neoliberal economics. And this was called the Third Way, the Democratic Leadership Council in the 1980s. And there's very little difference between them and Thatcher with her Big Bang, the idea that get the government out of the way. Now, Democrats continued for a period of time to still have this idea that government must play a role in aiding the poor and building the economy. Clinton was torn over this. Clinton ran for president saying he was going to have a major infrastructure development program. And there's a famous book by Woodward, he writes of a meeting right after Clinton was elected. Alan Greenspan came to see him in the Little Rock, Arkansas governor's mansion. They had lunch, and Clinton laid out all his plans for infrastructure. And Greenspan said, that's all well and good, young man. But if you want to get reelected, you have to make Wall Street happy. And the way to do that is to open the economy more for banking reform. And Greenspan, of course, along with Walt Wriston and a group of other internationalist bankers, was pushing in the 80s for total free market policy, no government interference, no regulation, privatization, deregulation, what we call today globalization. That was the policy that was foisted upon Clinton. Now, Clinton probably was more than happy to go with that because part of his background is the Rhodes Scholarship and his time studying the British rather than the American system. But he was sort of told, and there was even in 1997, 98, you had the Asia crisis. 98, it blew up, the Russian bond crisis, the GKO crisis. And Clinton was saying we need a reform of the financial system. The problem was, who was his top advisor then on economics? It was Robert Rubin. And Rubin was a protege of Walt Wriston and Citibank. And Rubin said, well, you make Wall Street happy, the country will be happy. And so I think the Democratic Party got pulled around the old Cold War Democrats. And then look what happened right before Clinton came in is you had the collapse of the Soviet Union. And there were some people who said we should help them develop their economy, develop a market economy. But the people who ran that were basically Wall Street and London bankers. And they said, well, this is an ideal opportunity for us to grab the raw material wealth of Russia. And the guy at the center of that, I'm sure you'll remember this name, Bob Strauss, the Democratic Party money man, the fixer from Dallas. And Strauss was the one who went over to Moscow and started advising them on what should be grabbed, what should be taken, nickel, the nickel deposits, the chrome deposits, the oil. And he was the one who selected the oligarchs who would be allowed to take those companies over. And then you had people like Bill Browder come in and set up hedge funds with London connections to essentially impose a shock therapy policy on Russia. Interesting, John, I don't know if you've been following this at all, but Jeffrey Sachs was one of their economic whiz kids who was sent in as a part of this. And Sachs was all for the shock therapy, but he said you have to have some therapy. You have to give them some credit. And Sachs eventually left the program because he said they wouldn't give any credit. And now Sachs is one of the leading advocates of negotiating with Putin, ending this war. So this fight in the Democratic Party was largely connected to Wall Street neoliberalism and just thievery, just people trying to get their hands on a lot of money. And then add the other problem with it was the green policy, the anti-industrial policy. And so that's the Democratic Party came closer and closer to the Republicans on strategic policy, war policy, without having any of the old Roosevelt counter to that. So that's how I see it. And what it does show is that the left and right have been a false dichotomy that's just been played for the gullible.
Thank you very much. That was so enlightening and so concise, and I really do appreciate it. I tried to hang on to a couple of questions as we went along. The first one is this: Averell Harriman, um, a son of E.J., right?
The
Harriman,
quintessential robber baron.
the quintessential robber baron, and one day he turns up as a Democrat. And this, to me, I think bears a little bit of explanation if you want to go into it, because the, the the article I read by David Livingstone resonated with me with that, because he's basically saying that before World War II, the establishment, quote unquote, was entirely business. It was the businessmen, the DuPonts and the businessmen. Whereas Roosevelt created, in the author's view, a new establishment, and he calls that the government establishment. Obviously, in recognition of the creation of so many departments and the extension of government into more and more parts of the life. The charge is that the Democrats now have created this different establishment that now can be beat up against, just like the old business establishment was beat up against by the Democrats. Now the Republicans can turn around and beat up this new establishment created by the Roosevelt Democrats. Well, all of this to me is the creation of what we now sometimes call the Uniparty. And well, anyway, you see where I'm going with this. Would you tell us a little bit more about the involvement of, and why does a Harriman suddenly become a Democrat?
Well, and remember, Harriman's younger brother was a fellow Skull and Bones member with George Herbert Walker Bush, or I'm sorry, Bush's father, Prescott Bush. And Roland Harriman and Prescott Bush set up a bank that funded the Nazis, funded Fritz Thyssen, who took the money he got from them and gave it to Hitler. What happened in the 20s after World War I is there was, actually it goes back to the 1890s and early 1900s, when the British had realized they couldn't win the United States back from the Revolutionary War. They couldn't use the Civil War to break the country apart. America was growing incredibly fast and powerful under the Hamiltonian policy that was implemented after the war, which was essentially Lincoln's policy. And it was a policy against free trade. It was a policy of national banking, even though they didn't have a national bank at that point. It was the Hamiltonian policy. And it was catching on around the world. And the decision was made that they had to break the United States away from that and make the United States a partner with the British. And Woodrow Wilson was the person they used for that. And one of the things they played on with Wilson, actually before Wilson was Teddy Roosevelt. Remember, McKinley was assassinated. McKinley was a Lincoln Republican, national bank man, a tariff man. He was assassinated and Teddy Roosevelt came in. And Roosevelt was promoting the book by Admiral Mahon about the strength of the British Empire based on the gift of God to place them on this island, and on and on and on. When Mahon's book came out, Roosevelt bought every single copy of it and handed it out to the entire Congress and said, we have to be the partner of this policy. The book was called Influence of Sea Power on History. Now, Wilson was somewhat in the image of the Teddy Roosevelt reformer. Roosevelt used the anti-monopoly against the Harrimans and the Rockefellers, the trust buster image, but it was really an internal fight. It didn't end the policies of monopoly capitalism. It just shifted who was the main winners. And included in that was, how do you give a bigger cut to some of the industrialists like Henry Ford and others coming up? Now, what happened in the 20s was the United States establishment made a decision to go with the British. And what that meant is they adopted the outlook that you have to have constant tension or division between France and Germany and between Germany and Russia. And Harriman was one of the Russian people. He was basically deployed to keep an eye on what was going on in Russia. He had investments in Russia and was involved with that. But Harriman was tied on the other side to the Wall Street banking interests. And so his family was directly involved in promoting Hitler through his brother. These are the networks that the Alan and John Foster Dulles grew up admiring. You know, the white shoe Wall Street firms, the connection between Wall Street lawyers and bankers. And they were the ones who were fighting against what initially they were. I wouldn't say they were pro-Roosevelt. They were suspicious of him, but they saw him as someone who they could work with. And when Roosevelt came in, the famous book by this University of Texas historian Brand is titled "Roosevelt, a Traitor to His Class." That's how they saw Roosevelt, that he basically said, we're not going to have the Hoover policy of laissez-faire, of letting the bankers have everything they want, even if it means a depression. We've got to have a regulatory system that protects the little guy from the special privileged interests. And Roosevelt got that from his study of Hamilton and the American system. And the people he was fighting were the pro-British system, who basically, you know, to put it in its more polite form, the trickle-down theory. But essentially the ones who said, if the rich get their way, if the industrialists and the bankers do well, then the country will do well. You know, what Coolidge said, the business of America is business. You know, it's that idea. And a whole section of the Democratic Party bought into that, but Roosevelt didn't. And we were fortunate that Roosevelt didn't, but the attempt after World War II and into the present time is to portray Roosevelt as a big government socialist. Now, this is where you see what I would say is the problem with the old line conservatives. Their view is that the power of the government is taking away the individual enterprise that builds fortunes. And that if you have regulation, it will blunt the initiative of the entrepreneurs and so on. And therefore, they say that Roosevelt created a whole new class, a whole new, as you just said, a new establishment. And that became self-serving. Well, what does that overlook? Who runs the government right now? It's not government officials who are out to help the people. It's government officials who are working with the corporate cartels. And that's where the question of credit is the central issue. Who has access to credit? Who makes credit? And the other part of this picture is the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. Because the Federal Reserve was not a bank of the United States. This is the other slander you get from so-called Austrian school conservatives. They say Hamilton wanted to have a national bank controlled by the government. Well, the Bank of the United States had very significant government influence, but it also had private sector. But the purpose of the government influence was to make sure credit was available for the real entrepreneurs, for the real capitalists, so to speak, the people who would invest in physical production and infrastructure and science and technology. And if all you do then is turn the money system over to people who want to make money, you know, Lyndon LaRouche used to ask this question: if you had $10,000 to invest, what would give you the quickest profit? Putting it into a steel company or into a whorehouse? And the answer is obvious. If someone's just out to make money, they'll do whatever it takes to make money, whether it's good for the economy and good for the people. And that's the problem. Credit is controlled now by these corporate cartels in finance and who have now financialized everything. And that's where the debt bubble comes from. It doesn't come from government. Government spending is too high because so much of it is going into areas like defense right now and into debt service on the national debt, because we keep going deeper in debt because we're producing less. If government extends credit through a national bank rather than a private financial system like the Federal Reserve, but through a national bank, you still let the bankers decide where it's going to go, who gets the credit. And it doesn't go to national companies or government-owned companies. It goes to the companies that can do the best job. That's what Hamilton did. That's what Lincoln's policy was. That's what John Kennedy was trying to do with the investment tax credit. And this is where you see the problem with Trump's policy. Trump's tax cut had no provision for where the corporate gains would go. Kennedy's investment tax credit said you get the tax credit if you invest in job-creating industry, new plant and equipment, research and development, things that add to the overall economy. The Trump tax cut, which I don't know how much Trump was fully aware of this, probably pretty much so, but under Mnuchin and others, the tax cut gave corporations all this money that was no longer taxable. They could do whatever they want with it. And what did they do? They went into speculation. They bought their own stock. They went into hedge funds. And this created, in the short term, wealth on the books, but not real physical value. And so the difference between the Roosevelt Democrats and the Lincoln Republicans versus the Biden Obama Democrats and the free trade Republicans, the difference is credit. Who controls it and where does it go? Is it directed by government, or is it allowed to go to whomever can get the quickest profit, quickest return for the buck? And that's the fight we have. And Democrats, many of them have become very wealthy through their involvement with the tech sector and the speculative banking interests, hedge funds.
Yeah, I was going to ask you to give me a refresher on hedge funds and why they're so useful in these situations.
Well, basically, you have people who now have money on their hands. And the initial idea of a hedge fund is that the idea of a hedge. If you have a bunch of money invested over here and you're a little worried about it, where can you have a counter if that goes bad? And at a certain point, hedge funds became one of the drivers behind the whole derivative market and the speculative system, because you take something like BlackRock, some of these equity funds that are flush with billions of dollars, they can make a stock of a company go up or down overnight. They bought into this idea of financialization, which is that instead of investing in physical economy, invest in paper. You have, in the short term, you'll make money. Now, what happens when the value of these financial assets go much higher than they actually have as underlying real value? In fact, today, many of the $2 quadrillion traded on derivative markets have nothing of underlying value. Derivative itself means derived from something of value, but with no intrinsic value of its own. So why would you even trade these things? Well, you create them so that you have a capability to flush around the money, spread around the money, use the liquidity that's created by the private banks, private banking system called the Fed. And so that's where inflation comes from. Now, if a government is well managed as a regulatory agency that protects the public interest, you will have private gains because that's the best way for a system to function. But if all you do is have a banking system that favors the private investor over the public interest, you're going to end up with a bubble economy. And it's actually a pretty simple thing to figure out. So the Democrats we're talking about, John, virtually all of them base their wealth on the speculative bubble, speculative markets. And they bought into this idea that when the stock market is up, that's progress. Now, when Trump ran for president, he attacked the so-called Obama post-2008 recovery by correctly pointing out that it was a stock market bubble, that it was a paper increase in wealth, and it wasn't a real, no real economic value. When he got in trouble as COVID hit, he ended up doing the same thing. We saw the stock market appreciate very rapidly under Trump, and he said, well, that's because of good economic policy. No, it was because the floodgates were open for more speculation. And this is where you see the confusion, which makes people susceptible to get rich quick schemes, because they don't see any way to make money other than through some get rich quick scheme, Ponzi scheme, basically.
And all of this has destroyed our confidence in the idea of a good independent regulator in the first place. Where do you find somebody that's going to have that kind of mentor-like attitude towards, oh, we're going to make this economy the best economy for all the good of all the people, and we're going to rise all the boats at the same time, and we're going to make sure that the people that do the work, that create the industry, that they get a reward, but that they don't ever get so powerful that they take over towns and cities and become the corporate bullies that we're trying to get rid of. Well, where do we find these people, and how do we reinvigorate confidence in government regulation?
Well, Franklin Roosevelt took advantage of someone who was actually appointed while Hoover was president, named Ferdinand Pecora, who set up a commission which became known as the Pecora Commission, which looked into the swindles that were being carried out by the DuPonts, the JP Morgans, and others, that included banks controlling utility companies, in a sense, the new trusts that were created in the 20s and then blew out in the Great Depression. And Pecora showed the personal corruption of these people. Thomas Lamont of the Morgan interests, JP Morgan himself, and City National Bank, and so on. He had these congressional hearings, and this created the environment in which Franklin Roosevelt could push through the Glass-Steagall bill. Glass-Steagall was a bill which essentially said we're going to have a wall of separation between speculation and physical economy, the commercial banking system. And it gave a program to protect commercial bank deposits. That was when the FDIC was started. And the idea was that you wanted people to put money in banks for their own savings, but also so the banks had some money they could loan for productive investments. But the speculative system could not coexist within a commercial bank and would have its own regulatory process. And if it loses money, there's no insurance, there's no bailout, at least no government bailout. And that system was in place from 1933 until 1999. And during that time, we had no serious banking crisis. We had a couple of stock bubbles that popped. But we had no serious banking crisis because of that wall of separation. But it started getting chipped away with the Reagan-Bush deregulation policies in the early 1980s. Greenspan at the Federal Reserve was advocating doing away with Glass-Steagall. Then you had Walt Wriston, you had Rubin, you had all these other Wall Street characters saying that this is hindering the ability to mix commercial deposits and commercial banking as a pool of capital for speculation. And so that's holding back the economy. That was essentially Thatcher's argument with the Big Bang in the 1980s in London. So that became the policy in the United States. Get rid of regulated banking. And so what happened? 1999, the Graham-Leach-Bliley, three Republicans, Phil Gramm, one of the leading spokesmen for British economics, pushed a bill to repeal Glass-Steagall. And from that time forward, commercial banks could have their money intermingled. You could have their speculative banking within the big commercial banks. And so all of a sudden you had a giant pool of liquidity and relatively low interest rates. So what happened? Well, one of the new financialized investment instruments was called mortgage-backed securities. And so they chop up a whole bunch of mortgages, put them into a bond, and sell them. And that was dependent on the mortgages being paid every month. Well, what happened when the mortgage values went way up, when people got second mortgages or renegotiated their loan to take advantage of the increase in the price of their house, and then all of a sudden lost their job or didn't have enough money to, when their loan went from interest only to interest in principal, or the sliding rates, adjustable rate system where the rates would go up and you'd end up owing more than you could make. So these instruments, the mortgage-backed securities, were suddenly seen for what they were, worthless. And as a result, we had a near complete collapse of the banking system in the United States. Between 5 and 7.5, 8 million families lost their homes. Many jobs were lost. Industries were shut down. And the only thing that compensated for that was the growth of the tech sector. But that took a while. In the meantime, they went with a new bubble economy with quantitative easing to bail out the system. So $23 to $27 trillion went to bail out the blowout of the mortgage-backed security system. Today, it's estimated we would need somewhere in the range of 100 to 200 trillion to bail out the system were you to have a chain reaction collapse. So that's why they've been pumping money, and now they're pulling back. They're trying to figure out how to leverage it. And their two ideas are green financial bubble, which is absurd. And the second idea is war economy, spend money on war. And that's what they discussed at Davos. That was the whole idea. In the back rooms at Davos, all the talk was about deglobalization and de-dollarization, because the whole global South is saying we want out of this system. But in the front rooms, what are they talking about? The importance of democracy, of standing firm with Ukraine, of going with the green policy. And it's a hope and a prayer that it doesn't all blow out. And that's why there was so much nervousness among the Davos hucksters when they were pushing their program at the WEF summit.
Al Gore looked absolutely comical. Did you see him exploding? He was just so angry. So, well, why can't we do this? Why can't we?
He looks like a debt bubble to me.
Oh, yeah, he is a walking bubble, all right. Anyway, so interesting, and again, I'm very grateful for that. Well, that's where I was going to go anyway. I just noticed one of the European politicians just said, and maybe it was one of the British guys saying, well, what we really need to do is to go to a war economy in peacetime. And perhaps that's what exactly what you're talking about. And what the essence of what you're saying is that this war, maybe it's about NATO's innate desire to, outdo Napoleon and Hitler and take Moscow. Maybe that's what it's really about. But maybe it's all about the spinning plates that are still up in the air, spinning around, and you're still trying to hold that pole straight up and down so it doesn't fall and the whole audience leaves and wants their money back. That tends to make sense to me, that the war is the vehicle for which the people are going to be tapped for just enough cash to keep the plates spinning long enough until they come up with something better. Is that a fair summary of what you're thinking?
Well, a war economy has two sides to it. One is it gives you a justification to cut spending. And so we see things like the collapse of the healthcare system in the United Kingdom. We see the same thing in Germany, same thing in the United States. There's no funds to even sustain the existing level of healthcare, much less to improve it. There's no money for rebuilding roads or high-speed rail or upgrading airports. If there's money for anything, it's going into bandwidth and tech sector. But that has a component which is military also. And it also means you're going to have a crackdown on wages. The finance minister of Canada, the Ukrainian Nazi Chrystia Freeland, at the World Economic Forum, said maybe the middle class should make a decision to take a wage cut. In other words, in order to win the war and to keep things stable, people will have to do with less. So war gives you the ideal excuse to ask people to sacrifice, to take a cut for the benefit of the freedom-loving, courageous Ukrainian fighters. Now, at the same time, they're pumping $100 to $200 billion into the NATO economies for war spending, which, the British just concluded that they need an enormous expenditure to have a real army. The word in NATO is that the British army is weaker than it's ever been. They can't even get their new ships out of port without having to send them back in for repairs. They don't have enough planes for their aircraft carriers that they promised to send into the South Pacific, the South China Sea. They have to borrow planes from the United States. And, what's the U.S. defense budget? Officially over 820 billion. But the current head of let me find his name here for you. The current head of the air transport system of the U.S. Army, General Minahan, said we're going to be at war with China by 2025, and we're not prepared for it. We need a massive buildup in the Pacific. And this term of a massive military buildup, that was coming out in France. But today in France, there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in the streets protesting Macron's economic policies. And it's not just his pension reform, which would have people retire an older retirement age. It's also now they're carrying signs, no more war spending. So if you can see that developing in France, in Germany now, some of the social democrats are quite angry by what Baerbock said about how we're at war. But what's interesting is the most popular political figure in Germany now is Sarah Wagenknecht, who is a leftist. She's the former head of the Linkspartei, which is the left party. But she's now also the most popular political figure on the right because she's anti-war, she's anti-green, and by anti-green, I mean she's attacking the Greens as the war party. So, I think we're going to see some real shifts going on in Europe. I despair a little bit about the United States because I don't see any figure who's really talking seriously about this. I mean, you have Paul Gosar from Arizona who's saying no more money for Ukraine. You have a couple of Massey, Rand Paul, a couple of others, but none of them are connecting the weakness of the United States financially and economically to the drive for war. And the other part of the drive for war is it's not just for a war economy. It's fear that as the Western economies collapse, that there'll be a break with the present unipolar system. That's why at Davos, the question of de-dollarization and deglobalization. I don't know if you saw this, but the U.S. had an envoy in Brazil, Argentina, and Colombia asking for weapons for Ukraine, and they were told no by those three countries. And those are three countries that are at the center of reviving the idea for a South American common market and a common currency. The same talk is going on. I was on a radio show yesterday in Pakistan, or television show, and the question came up, what about this new Pakistan-Russia relationship? Is it just about energy? Because Pakistan needs energy. They're broke. Russia has plenty of energy. They're working out a deal with them. But more importantly, it's the global South looking for a way out of the International Monetary Fund anti-sovereign world order. That's the Wall Street British order. So I'm hopeful that the Democrats and Republicans can huff and puff as much as they want about our great democracy. But if they don't change the policy, we're going to be more broke than Ukraine or Afghanistan. And who can we turn to help us then? So I think we still have an opportunity to break with this idea of a unipolar world system and work on more multilateral deals, but we're running out of time. And John, we have a conference this Saturday starting at 10 a.m. Eastern time. It will be on the schillerinstitute.com, where we'll be discussing with a number of people who are part of a global peace movement, a movement for a new development, financial, economic order. It will be a fascinating discussion, and I would urge all of your viewers to go register now. It's at the schillerinstitute.com. It's online. It's an all-day conference, and it will be archived if you're busy on Saturday. But I think it's an opportunity to get the full picture of both the crisis and the opportunity.
Well, you certainly have fleshed out my understanding this morning or this afternoon over there in Germany, and I sure do appreciate it once again, Harley. I myself am really getting. I'm going to go back to that David Livingstone article and try just to understand exactly how it is that that this racist label of the entire Republican world, especially anybody that has a MAGA hat, how it was this spell was cast and how we can get rid of it, because it's within those people that I think we have to find. And again, with the real left in the Democratic Party, the Bernie brothers or whatever you want to call these people getting together, to me, is the only way out. Because
John, remember in 2008, 2009, after the housing collapse, the mortgage-backed security collapse, the Obamacare debate, you had a moment where the Occupy Wall Street movement and the Tea Party movement agreed on two fundamental issues: no bailouts for the banks and no bailouts for big pharma and big hospital corporations. That was a moment, had there been leadership, we could have had the change we needed. The problem was we were among the only people who understood that, and LaRouche had been made a toxic name by the media that were trying to keep people apart. We have the same opportunity today, and people should get rid of these ideas of left and right and big government and anti-government and actually look at what it is that creates real value in an economy. And it's human creativity, and it's something that's innate in all people. And I think that this is also the way the Republicans can get out from under this racist label that's being attached to them, because the common interest in all of us is that our fellow man succeed, that people escape poverty and have an opportunity. And that's really the direction we have to go.
Okay, and kudos to the young people coming up through the Schiller and LaRouche organizations. The vocal ones are making a big splash. And Diane and Jose and Anastasia and the rest of you guys, I'm proud of you. Way to go.
And it's exciting.
All right. Thanks, Harley. See you again.
Okay, John. See you in 2 weeks.
All right. Bye now. Bye, everybody. I'll see you guys tomorrow night with David. And we're going to be discussing the Inter-Alpha Group, Jacob Rothschild, and the financial crash of 2008. So the Pecora Commission and things like that will be on the agenda. That's tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Bye now.